In this edition of The Great Game, dear viewer, I'm going to talk to you about the upheaval in Nepal, the Himalayan Republic just to the north of India, a country with which India has a very close, very deep-seated and a very, very profound relationship. Now, you know that over the last 1 week, if some of you may have read the Tribune newspaper, you would have seen that we've had a lot of coverage on this Nepal crisis. Now, students in Nepal, young protesters, they call themselves the Gen Z or the Generation Z, young people who have probably never seen a revolt or a protest in their lives, came out on the streets of Kathmandu and across Nepal and several towns of Nepal to protest against the highly corrupt politicians that have ruled them over the last several decades. Now, in the Tribune, in the pages of the Tribune over the last 1 week, we've had a lot of reportage on this Nepal crisis. Namrata Sharma, a journalist in Nepal, has been reporting every day, and you would have seen some of her stories in the Tribune newspaper. We've had two former Indian ambassadors to Nepal, Mr. Ranjit Ray, who wrote for us early in the week about how this is a crisis that is a homegrown crisis, meaning it's not a conspiracy theory that other countries, whether the US or the China, have provoked or instigated. But this is a crisis that people in Nepal, that young people have felt very strongly about, that the dividends of democracy, the fruits of democracy that were garnered from the 2006 Jan Andolan, the People's Andolan or the People's Rebellion, that has been frittered away these last 15 years or 20 years or so by these corrupt politicians that have been ruling them. We've also had Jayant Prasad, another former Indian ambassador to Nepal, writing about this crisis, as well as General Ashok Mehta, a former general in the Indian Army who has very deep and very connected roots in Nepal, not just in Kathmandu, but also in the Pokhara Valley. I'm Jyoti Malhotra with the Tribune, and my column, The Great Game, in this Saturday morning edition of the newspaper is called Nepal's Upheaval and its Lessons for India. But let's start at the very beginning and ask ourselves what happened in Nepal on Monday and through the rest of this week. Now, we know that on Monday there was a big protest that was organized by civil society in which several young students, even in school uniform, participated. Now, the armed police, the Nepal armed police, opened fire. First there was tear gas, then they opened fire. And that includes not just tear gas shelling, but also live ammunition. As many as 19 people were killed in that protest, including young children in school uniform. Now, that created a huge resentment, a lot of anger on the streets of Nepal. And the next day we saw how the city, how Kathmandu, the capital of Nepal, was practically burnt to the ground. The parliament, the Supreme Court, the archives, the government building, government offices, a lot of property was not just devastated, it was burnt to the ground. And a lot of questions that are being asked ever since is that who participated, who instigated this burning? We also know that some of these Gen Z or Generation Z protesters, some of their leaders, are now disavowing themselves. They have said very clearly that they did not participate in any of the violence. We will come to that later. But a lot of other very significant questions have emerged, people speculating about the future of Nepal, what happens next. Now, perhaps one of the most significant outcomes of this people's protest was the election via an online poll, admittedly, of Sushila Karki, a former Chief Justice of Nepal, who has been named the interim Prime Minister of Nepal. She was sworn into this position on late Friday night by the President Ramchandra Paudel. But therein hangs a tale, dear viewer, which is that Ramchandra Paudel, the President of Nepal, a former Nepali Congress politician, a card-carrying Democrat, a Democrat who swore by the Constitution that he will uphold the Constitution of Nepal, went missing, within quotes again, for a few days in the immediate aftermath of the Tuesday protest in which these buildings that I talked about a few minutes ago, when a large parts of Nepal were burnt down. So where was Ramchandra Paudel? Now, some say that he was taken to the Army Staff College, which is an area just north of Kathmandu, about 12 to 15 kilometers away from Kathmandu, to an area called Shivpuri Nagarjun. Some say that no, he did not go there, that he was moved to a safe house around Sheetal Nivas, which is the name of the president's official home, but he was taken away from his home, which was ransacked, incidentally, by some of these student protesters. So Mr. Paudel was taken away out of his home to another place. He has since returned to Sheetal Nivas, which is where the swearing-in ceremony of Sushila Karki, the first woman prime minister, albeit she's an interim prime minister, took place on Friday evening. So very clearly, Nepal is desperate to return to some sort of normalcy. But let me tell you, dear viewer, a little bit about what happened behind the scenes this past few days. Now, like I said, in the wake of the Monday protest, you had the Tuesday violence on the streets of Kathmandu and elsewhere in Nepal, but primarily on the streets of Kathmandu. And between Tuesday and Friday night, when Sushila Karki was sworn in, a lot of things happened. The first is that the army chief, the Nepal army chief, Ashok Raj Sigdel, had a number of conversations with these Gen Z leaders, with some of them. He tried to involve some of the pro-monarchy parties, those that still hold sway with the former king Gyanendra. And some of these monarchists, a gentleman called Durga Parsai, he's a politician himself, and he's part of the Rashtriya Prajatantra Party, which is a pro-monarchy party. He was seen in pictures with the Nepal army chief, and there was some attempt, it is believed that there was some attempt on the part of the army chief to tell the student leaders that they should listen and have a conversation at least with these monarchist politicians. But the student leaders refused outright, and they said that Nepal cannot go back to being a monarchy. So that's the very first important outcome. The second is that these student leaders demanded to know where Ramchandra Paudel, the president, was. And like I said before, that he had not been seen for a few days. So these student leaders said that they wanted to know where their president was and that he should be out there in front, talking to the people, reassuring them that things would be better henceforth. Because as you know, that the former Prime Minister KP Oli was forced to resign, and that another former Prime Minister, Sher Bahadur Deuba, and his wife, Arzu Rana, who was the foreign minister in the previous regime, that is in KP Oli's regime, and a lot of these politicians seen to be highly corrupt, their children to be highly corrupt, living these very luxurious lifestyles, or what we call the Nepo kids, or kids of nepotism, which is where the phrase comes from. And this disgust around these very luxurious lifestyles of these elected politicians of Nepal, which is what these young students were protesting about. Now, another very important lesson that we have learned from these protests this week has been that these student leaders, these Gen Z protesters, also said that we want to abide by the Constitution of Nepal. And the reason this is very important, dear viewer, is because the Constitution of Nepal, which came into being in 2015 only, that's only 10 years ago, went through many, many twists and turns. And just to give you a little bit of history, in 2006, when the Jan Andolan took place, the People's Movement, I was there actually reporting that Jan Andolan, and it was quite an incredible sight. 19 days of more or less a peaceful, more or less, I say more or less because 18 or 19 people were killed even in that protest. But for 19 long days and nights, Kathmandu came to a standstill because thousands and thousands of young people, middle-aged and older people, came out in the streets against the monarchy. They wanted an abolition of monarchy and a full-scale return to democracy. That had been promised to the people during the multi-party democratic protests back in 1990. Even then, King Birendra at the time had promised that democracy would rule in Nepal, but then he went back on that promise. And in 2006, during that Jan Andolan, the second one, that promise was fulfilled by the people. They gave it to themselves. And in my column in the Tribune this Saturday morning, dear viewer, I also talk about how at the time in 2006, the former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran, who's also a columnist in the Tribune, and you do read his columns, he broke with India's traditional policy of adhering to a constitutional monarchy and multi-party democracy. He broke away from that and acceded to the demands of the people of Nepal. Now, how do we understand this protest of these last few days? And there are 4 lessons, I think, that we here can learn in India from the Nepali protests. The first is, and as I noted in my column in the Tribune this Saturday morning, which is that India and Nepal have a very deep-seated, very profound, very intimate relationship. People marry into each other's families. There are similar castes, the Brahmins, the Kshatriyas, the OBCs, across the border, the Terai and the Indian states of Bihar, UP, West Bengal, Uttarakhand. It's an open border between our two countries, and that's really a very, very special relationship between India and Nepal. So these ties of kinship that have reinvented the generations. And I believe, and I have said in my column, that India should not let go of this very important relationship. Nepali leaders, politicians of today, Sushila Karki herself has studied at the Banaras Hindu University. And I believe that Indian politicians who have seemed to have lost sight or lost interest, if you like, not just Indian politicians, but also the elite Indian Foreign Service diplomats, some of whom don't want to serve in the neighborhood, including in smaller countries like Nepal, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka. They would much rather go to the more popular watering holes of the West. But I would like to argue very strongly that India cannot outgrow its neighborhood. It must remain the most important foreign policy story of our times, not just a story. The most important foreign policy relationships of India must be its neighborhood. And this crisis in Nepal, which caught everybody by surprise, including the Indian establishment. In fact, the former Prime Minister KP Oli was supposed to begin a visit to Delhi only a few days from now. But of course, the protest caught everyone flat-footed, caught everyone off guard. And now everybody is taking a deep breath. A new chapter in the history of Nepal has opened. This is the Naya Nepal. What does India make of it? Thank you so much for watching, dear viewer. I'd urge you to read the Tribune and tell me not just what you think of this video, but also of all the articles that have come out on the Nepal crisis in our newspaper over the last few weeks. Do follow us on all our social media handles, and thank you so much for watching.